Hello everyone, my name is Alice and I work for Manchester University Press, and I'm delighted that you're joining us for what promises to be an excellent armchair event with Carey Fleiner. Before I hand over to Carey, I would like to do a little bit of housekeeping. For those who haven't participated in an event with us before, on your screen you should see an event dashboard containing a question and chat option. The question option is for you to type questions throughout the talk, which Carey will hopefully get around to answering during the Q&A session at the end of the event. Please do ask questions. From the events we've already done, we know that the authors have really appreciated this interaction with their audience. The chat option is for you to raise any problems during the event, particularly technical problems, which we will do our best to try and fix for you. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Carey.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining this armchair event with me. My name is Carey Fleiner, and I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Winchester, specializing in classical history, specifically Roman history, which is why I wrote this particular book. I teach on topics that include the Julio-Claudians, sport and recreation in the Roman world, and a lot of stuff about the Emperor Nero. And I put together this book, a writer's guide to ancient Rome, based on a number of the lectures and student seminars that I've given over the years. I've been teaching more or less for about 20 years now. It's not a how to write a book, so sadly I won't be able to give you any advice here on plot structure or characterization. Instead, what I've done with this book is put together some topics that I thought would be useful to anyone who would like to set a story or poem or film or game in ancient Rome. So basically creating your fictional version of a historical place. The main period that I cover in the book is roughly from around 200 BC. So that's just after and right around the time of Hannibal and the Second Punic Wars and Macedonian Wars, through to AD 200. So that's just after the Emperor Commodus, the Emperor and Gladiator. I do touch on stuff that comes before that period. So there's some stuff in the book about the early Republican period and bits and pieces that come after this period. So the crisis of the 3rd century and the fall of Rome. But this period between 200 BC and AD 200 is the period that most people who aren't historians or classicists are familiar with, because this is where all the greatest hits are when you think about it. So it's the fall of the Republic and Cicero and Julius Caesar and all that. The early emperors that people are familiar with, such as Augustus and Caligula and Nero, they're all in there. And then, of course, gladiators at the end and fall of the Roman Empire. That film is at the end of that period as well. So in putting the book together, I'm hoping that it helps anyone who might be looking at that particular period and just wants to know more about where to find resources, where to find sources, both primary sources and secondary sources. It's not my intention with this particular book to tell anybody how you should write your story. Okay, you don't have to be 100% historically accurate. It's not a test, it's not an exam if you decide to write historical fiction. To me, I think some of my favorite Roman stories are some of the silliest. So, for example, I don't know if you're familiar with it or you remember it, but the Goodies did an episode that takes place in Nero's Rome. Actually, it's called The Romantics, which is a bit hard to find. Of course, you've got Life of Brian setting the gold standard there for silliness. As far as I know, there weren't too many space aliens wandering around in 1st century Palestine. This book allows anyone who'd like to get a feel for Roman culture and customs and some general overview about the big aspects of Roman society in one-stop shopping. So amongst the chapters, there's 8 chapters in the book. There's a chapter that starts off with the Roman people and what you would expect just in Roman manners. How do people speak? How do they arrange themselves on the social scale? What the importance of the social strata, for example. There's a chapter on the basic necessities such as food and drink and how the Romans would clothe themselves. Then we cover shelter and housing, so the different places where Romans would live, whether it's in the country or in the city, and attitudes towards living in the country and the city, how to get around in the Roman world, so travel, things like that. There's a chapter on the basics of the economy, which was terrifying for me to write because I'm not an economic historian, but it worked out in the end. The basics of law and order with some military stuff in there. I've got a chapter on leisure activities. I couldn't include everything that I wanted to, but again, I hit the highlights. So there's stuff in there about gladiators and chariot racing, as you do, but also board games, taking holidays, that sort of thing. And a chapter on religion and general religious trends that you would find in the Roman world that maybe you might want to get stuck into or put into your story. That's only 7 chapters. The 8th one is your resources. So it goes topic by topic that would have been covered in those chapters, helping you to find primary sources, a lot of stuff online that you can use if you want to read up and get some actual dialogue and text, and a lot of scholarship that if you want to read even more closely into some of these topics, where you can go. So it's a potpourri of things that you might want to read to bone up on Roman history, depending who or what your stories are going to be about. So in that regard, I have added lots of examples from primary sources, plus lots and lots of links so that you can go off and wallow in the Vindolanda tablets yourself, or Suetonius, or whatever you want to do. I find, even as a historian, that it can be really frustrating when you see references to particular aspects of Roman society and you think, oh, I want to read more about that. You hear about, oh, the Romans had a crazy punishment for people who are parasites. Well, why haven't they linked any sources to that? Or I'm sure you've seen on television and you've seen in movies where somebody says, I'm going to decimate this barbarian tribe. Well, what does that mean? Did the Romans kill 1 in 10, or does it mean to wipe people out? So what I've done is try to dig out where all these sources come from, and all these particular references come from that show up as cliches over and over again in films. Other things that I try to give you resources for that people have asked me about is, well, how do I find names? How do I give Romans the correct sort of name and the correct sort of structure? And I don't want everyone to be called Gaius, and I don't want everyone to be called, Julius or whatever. Where can I come up with some other names? People who I've got a friend who writes a lot of historical fiction, crime fiction, and how do you find out what the crimes actually are and what the punishments were? So I've tried to point people in the direction of the law codes that they might find interesting, the rules for board games, all that sort of thing. These are things that you can find throughout the book. We've got little tables scattered throughout the chapters of the book where you can find some of these primary sources. In addition to primary sources, I've also included a lot of scholarship on these topics. It's not to bore you. I mean, a historian can make just about anything boring because we can't help it. We just pick things to death. But that's not my intention here. Again, these are meant to be sources and resources that you can read if you just want to read up more about what's happening in the late Republic, or you want a quick and dirty biography of Nero. So the sources range from general and straightforward reference books that someone who's not an historian or not a classicist might not necessarily be familiar with straight away. So some of these sources include things such as the Oxford Classical Dictionary, which I was going to get down, but there's too much stuff in the way. The Oxford Classical Dictionary, something like the Cambridge Ancient History, which is a multi-volume series where you can look up what's going on in the various provinces at the time that you're writing on, or the economic history in the time that you're writing on. And I go from these general sources and general textbooks down to more specialized works on the topics and subtopics that I cover, so that if you want to know a little bit more about what the historians think and how historians and archaeologists, how the linguists reconstruct and put together Roman society, so you get some idea of how you can create your society. You can get stuck into that. You can look at historical trends. You can look at what some of the arguments have been amongst historians. It's a multidisciplinary approach that I take and my colleagues take when we put together our lectures. And this is something we try to tell our students. And I think it can be really effective too if you're writing fiction, to see that how an historian, how an archaeologist, and how a linguist is going to interpret the same source. And that can give some more dimension to what you're writing about. So my intention here is to suggest further reading to help you get stuck into or to clarify context as you create your fictional version of the Roman world. Another thing that I do in the book that crosses over all of the chapters is to point out particular themes that run through Roman society and culture, and that cross a lot of the big topics that we cover in each chapter. I think these sorts of themes are useful to be aware of, even if you want your Romans to be really, really silly and as anachronistic as possible. That's absolutely fine. And I've got 3 examples of themes. I'm just going to discuss very, very generally. I promise I'm not going to lecture anybody. That's fine. You're safe. One theme that runs throughout the book is this whole idea of Roman social identity. You know, how did the Romans know they were Roman? How did the Romans define Romanness? And when do they distinguish Roman from somebody else? So this us versus them, does it happen suddenly? Is there some particular catalyst that gets the Romans thinking about themselves? So this whole idea of us versus them. And that takes us into topics of what do the Romans emphasize in their myths, for example, or their histories and biographies in terms of Roman identity and what they're writing about. It could take you into a discussion of how the Romans commemorate their achievement. You know, why should they be proud of something they've done? When the Romans write about barbarians, are they telling us more about themselves than they are about these barbarians? So things to think about there in terms of identity with the Romans. Ooh, I see some questions coming in. I will get to your questions, I promise. Another theme that I look at in the book, because it's so endemic in Roman society, is social status. The Romans were very concerned about hierarchy and where you fit on the social strata and who ranked over whom. The Romans could be really snobby, to be perfectly frank. Aristocrats look down on the newly wealthy. The upper classes, which can include both patricians and plebeians, they look down on freedmen, who are the newly freed slaves who might be trying to make a name for themselves. Romans in Italy look down on the provincials for being country bumpkins. And then you have provincials who look down on other provincials who are farther and farther out away, closer to the frontier. Then everybody all together looked down on outsiders. It's everywhere. So everybody had some reason to look down on somebody else. If you want to keep in mind Roman social status, you have to remember that it's reflected in everything the Romans did. Nobody carries around an ID card, but you can identify a Roman's social economic status by the way they speak, by the way they dress, how they entertain their guests at dinner parties, the type of house they live in, what their very name was. So that's a theme that runs through all of the chapters, is something that I point out to be aware of with these different aspects of Roman status. You know, how you were punished for committing a crime is going to change whether you were a patrician or whether you were plebeian or whether you were a slave, which is a completely different kettle of fish. A third theme, and I'm just going to keep it at 3 because that's the magic number, that appears throughout the book and appears throughout Roman society, is patronage and attitudes towards the poor and the less fortunate. And again, you can see how these are all tied in together. So identity and status is all going to be tied into patronage as well. A patron is someone who can do you a favor that you can't fully repay. So as I point out to my students, your very first patron is going to be your mother, actually, because you can't fully repay her. And if you've got a mother like mine, she reminds you of this at every available opportunity. Patrons can do a lot for you. They can get you a job. They can get you a position in the military. They can help you in politics. Patrons can also do a lot for their city. So they can put up new buildings, they can supply you with grain, they can entertain you. So a patron is going to be a very important person, and a patron is usually commemorated publicly as well. So in return, they're going to be acclaimed and commemorated. No one in pagan Roman society, and I tend to focus more on the pagans than the Christians, did anything strictly out of charity. Doing a favor for somebody strictly out of charity and not expecting anything in return, not expecting any acclamation in return, is more of a Christian concept. So patronage is this public reminder of your status and your authority. The Romans were sticklers for both. And again, you can see this evidenced in building structures. You can see all the inscriptions that are on buildings, for example. A really good example of seeing patronage in action and attitudes towards rich and poor, social status and identity are the games and the big spectacles. These are public events that are meant to entertain, but they also demonstrate the reach and the wealth of Rome's empire. They show you the consequences of Roman authority and what happens to you if you disobey Roman authority. They also show you what happens if your fortunes go bad. The Romans didn't have much sympathy for people who became poor or people who became enslaved. It's just what happened. It could happen to anybody. It could happen to you tomorrow. They saw it more as a character flaw and bad luck than something that you needed to be pulled out of. That said, patrons still looked after the poor, and again, this sometimes to show off to other patrons. But you have these public handouts, for example, for the vulnerable. Another demonstration of the state's might on the one hand. Excuse me. Not now. The patron's might on the one hand, and the largesse of a patron on the other. There's plenty of other themes in the book. There's the Roman love of family that I go into, the Roman love of land, the ingrained values of collegiality and consensus, the whole martial spirit that embodied the Roman mindset, the whole idea that Roman heroes are human and can be emulated by anybody according to his or her own means. It's not like the Greeks, for my Greek colleagues out there, that Greek heroes tend to be demigods. Roman heroes are human beings that anybody can emulate. So I hope if you pick up the book that you find this sort of context and these resources helpful, and that it gives you a basic platform on which you can build your characters and your plot. And that's why I include so much about the sources and the resources. The last thing that I just want to say about the book before I go on to, I've been asked to give you some writing tips. Just the last thing that I wanted to say is a little bit about something called classical reception. And if you are an author writing historical fiction, then you are engaging in classical reception, which is how later eras and later people and cultures interpret the classical world, whether it's the Greeks or the Romans and what have you. The original audience for these sources that you're looking at to create your book are gone. So the original context is gone. So how we interpret these sources and how we relate to these monuments that are left behind comes with our own filters. It comes with our own baggage of how we're going to try to imitate or emulate the Roman world. So I've got a little bit in the book about that if that's something that you'd be interested in getting stuck into. Many of us who got into classical history, Roman history, medieval history, what have you, is usually the result of some form of classical reception, especially maybe films or television, or you saw something in the theater, or you saw a museum exhibition. That's all how the public learns about Roman history. So basically, as authors and creators, that's what we're all doing, whether we're lecturing on these topics or creating a really nice story or putting together a game. Okay, so that's enough blathering from me about general things. I'm going to do a little bit of, I was asked to come up with some writing tips for you. Yeah, Manchester asked me to give you some writing tips. I was going to joke and say the first one is don't take any writing tips from me, but I do have a few because whether you write historical fiction, whether you write nonfiction, I think a lot of these bits and pieces that I've been given as tips over the years and that I've given my students as feedback are helpful to anybody. So I'll just have a quick whip through with those and then can address questions because I can see some questions are popping up. So bear with me. So just some of my basic tips here. I suggest read a lot. So read for fun as well as style and idea and content. So if there's a particular genre or a particular style that you really like and you want to start building your own style from that, I think doing lots and lots of reading and seeing what other people are up to can help. It's one way to get ideas. It's one way to get past a roadblock sometimes. And it's also just fun. It's one of the things about the lockdown is I've had an opportunity to do a lot more fictional reading than I have been in the past. Another tip is if you're writing historical fiction, this is just me. I would suggest that you do your homework. Just even looking basic info, taking a walk down Wikipedia lane, however you want to get some sort of general context. And I can make some recommendations if you want something a little more substantial than Wikipedia. Even if you look at school textbooks and you see what children are learning about Roman history or Egyptian history or wherever you want to set your story, because that gives you an idea of what your audience would be expecting to see. So you can decide, do you want your audience to be really comfortable with what you're writing, or do you want to shake them up a little bit? So if you have an idea of what your audience is doing, that's one way to get started there. Let's see. When I've written, even though it's been nonfiction, sometimes when I get stuck, I'll take a walk and we'll actually act out scenes. And I have a colleague, my crime fiction colleague, who I see is asking me questions here on the chat. I know she does something very similar. When you get stuck with a particular scene, or you get stuck with dialogue, or sometimes when I get stuck on a lecture I want to do, I just go out and give it. You don't have to worry about social distancing. Just go out and start acting out all your roles and doing all the conversation yourself. I've acted out scenes and dialogue, just taking walks with the dog I used to walk, and sometimes just on my own. It guarantees you a seat on the train by yourself, let me tell you that much. But I find that even when I have to do lectures and stuff, whether you want to act it out or you simply want to take a brisk walk, any kind of exercise, I think it just helps. It gets you away from your desk, it gets you away from the pad, it gets you out in fresh air. So that's just another one of my wee bit of tips there. There's a couple other ones. In terms of how you get ideas, I have had people ask me where I get ideas from. How do you know what to write? I had a relative that always asked me that. How do you know what to do? How do you know what to start with? It would be nice if we could all take the time to commune with the pixies and just lie back on a grassy knoll and watch the clouds and wait for inspiration to strike. But we all have deadlines, unfortunately, and the real world comes beckoning. So I had to learn I had to practice on getting an idea. And again, a lot of time what works for me is free association. My students like to build word clouds sometimes, and they like to do little rainstorms and things like that. So whatever works best for you. I mean, sometimes people take writing workshops, and there's all kinds of little writing exercises, there's little prompts you can do. I know you can get these little diaries that day by day have little writing prompts and things like that in there. So it's good practice. It helps to flex that sort of muscle there. Okay, what else do I have here? Because I was putting it off. Procrastination, procrastination and time management. Hello, again, I'm the worst person in the universe to be asking about this. With procrastination and putting things off because you dread doing it, I don't know about you guys, but when I procrastinate, it actually makes me feel worse because I know it's hanging over me and I know that I'm skiving off and I'm not doing it. What's worked for me over the years, and either being in school, being a teacher, writing and all that, is to divide the task up into doable goals. Maybe today I'm just going to outline a small part, or maybe I'm just going to write 500 words. I mean, to be perfectly honest with you, when I was writing this Roman book, there did come a time the summer before I handed in the manuscript that I finally just said, no, that's it. I've got to write 500 words a day. That's just how it has to go. It doesn't matter if they're absolute garbage. I've got to write 500 words. So just setting those little goals helps to divide up a big project, I think, and make it a bit less scary and daunting in doing that. And I also find that if you have done your writing for the day, or you've done your preparation for the day, if you plan, and at least with me, if I plan and I set up my writing station or whatever it is I plan to do for the next day, so that when I come the next day I can immediately start, that really helps. Because I think sometimes what makes me feel kind of intimidated is that, well, we talked about it if you saw it on Twitter, the blank page is staring and waiting for you. So sometimes if I'm finished for the day, I take that blank page and I might put a title heading on it, or I might just start jotting down some ideas of things that I want to write about the next day, and then I can go away with a clear conscience, at least about that. Just a couple other little things here, because there's lots of questions that I think are more interesting than what I'm having to say. Revise, 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 revise. There's nothing that you write down that cannot be revised and cannot be tinkered with. So I wouldn't feel intimidated thinking, oh, I've got to fill up this page and it's got to be absolutely perfect. No, nobody's perfect. And people might tell you they're perfect, but they're full of themselves. Anything can be revised, and it doesn't matter if you're like me, I just write down everything I can possibly think of, and I think I'm going to come back and fix it. I'm going to fix it in post-production. Or if you do plot along very slowly and carefully, always come back and revise. Whatever it is that you're writing, give it a little chance to breathe, step away from it for a couple of days. If you've got longer time and a longer luxury to be able to step away from it, it's amazing when you come back, because it's left your headspace a little bit. And when you come back to it, you can look at it with fresh eyes. So never be afraid to revise. Never be afraid to cut things out. I know I get this with my students, I get this with myself. You don't want to delete anything you wrote because you think, well, I wrote it. I can't possibly get rid of it. You sometimes have to trim things. Sometimes there's paragraphs there that don't belong there, or there's a sentence that's so awkward that to try to fix it, you're just going to get into more trouble. What I do is I simply create a file. That's all the deleted stuff. So I'm not really getting rid of it, I'm just moving it. Sometimes I come back to it because some of that stuff can just form the notes to the next thing that you want to write. But I think it helps you in the revision process. You don't feel like you've wasted your hard work. So that's another thing that I do. I suppose finally, in terms of tips, I've got cat hair all over me. I suppose finally, in terms of tips, embrace your own system. So you might be listening to me talk thinking, well, that's a really great idea, but it contradicts what somebody else said to me. Whatever works for you. I like to write my first drafts longhand, even though I absolutely hate transcribing. I don't know why I do it to myself, but I do it all the time. So I like to write all my first drafts in longhand. You can't see it because I threw all the junk in the room on the other side of the computer, so you can't see it at the moment. But I've got 3 notepads that are filled with writing and notes and drafts for a chapter that I'm currently working on for something else, because I just find writing by hand is so much easier. Another form of writing that really, really works for me when I'm stuck is writing a lecture. For some reason, just putting lectures together is really easy, probably because I'm thinking, well, I've got a formula, and if I was teaching this to my year 2 students, what do I need to include? And so sometimes I'll just take my writing and make it into a lecture, and there it is. It comes out more logically, because that sort of pressure's off to perform when you do that, and it's gotten me past some really difficult points. So there you go. Get feedback from other people. Some people like writing classes and workshops. I get other people to read my stuff for me, especially people not in my field. Sometimes people who aren't in your field will ask the best questions about style and organization. I guess the last thing to say about that is, if you do that, get someone who's going to give you constructive criticism. Avoid toxic people, because life is too short. Okay, I get rejected from things all the time. I get rejected from grant applications. I get rejected from conference proposals and all that sort of thing. It's going to happen. It's just one of those things. It's highly competitive, whatever it is you're doing. I always allow myself 24 hours to have an absolute meltdown and a pity party, and then I get back to whatever it is that I have to do. But having a support system, I think, and having somebody who's going to read your stuff and be honest with you, because you need that too. Yeah, so that's about it as far as my tips go and my little thing here. So
Thanks,
I need
Carey.
there you go. I was going to say I need to alert Alice.
Thank you. And with some great advice for budding authors, the questions are coming in, but I'd like to ask, what's the best piece of advice you've been given as an author?
I think, it's actually come from people who have rejected my stuff. Some of the, it's going to sound really like a contradiction in terms, but some of the best rejections are the people who really took seriously what I submitted. And some of the best advice that I've gotten is to let whatever it is I'm working on just sit for a little while, maybe turn my attention to something else and come back to that original piece, not to give up on it, but to give it a little bit of breathing space.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So I sent you over some questions from our attendees.
Okay. Yeah, I can see questions on the menu, but the problem is I'm only seeing like one word of them as they've been moving.
If you click on them, I think it will open up in the box below and you can see the full question.
So here we go. Joe has asked me what my favorite nonfiction is. My favorite nonfiction, probably music books, because my other hat that I wear is I do a lot of stuff with mid 20th century pop music. So I confess that I like to read it's not so much band biographies, but you know, there's sort of books that come out and they say things like 100 things you didn't know about the Beatles and that sort of stuff. But I read a lot of nonfiction about pop music and that, and obviously a lot of nonfiction that's related to my work. But in terms of reading nonfiction for fun, it's going to be stuff on pop music. So nice, thank you. Oh, I see. So I'm using a touchpad to get to everybody's questions here. It's really tiny, so bear with me. Oh, somebody was asking what a word cloud, WORD cloud is. If you go onto just your Google search engine and you type in word cloud, there's a lot of little programs out there that'll generate one of these things for you. Usually what you can do is upload, like if you've made your Word document and you've been taking a lot of notes, and you can upload your document to this software, and it literally generates a little cloud, and whichever words you're using the most are going to be really big. So it'll form like a little circular shape. Some of them are really clever. I've done ones that are shaped like cats. What a surprise. And it gives you an idea of maybe what words you're using over and over again, but it can also help you to pull out what certain themes are. So if you see one particular word popping up over and over and over again in whatever these notes are that you've been writing, sometimes that can be really helpful, and think, oh, I thought this chapter was going to be about X, but it turns out I'm writing a lot about Y instead. So and you can have a lot of fun with them. You can upload all kinds of stuff to them. I've uploaded whole chapters from books and lectures and things like that, and think, golly, I didn't realize I mentioned that word that many times. So if you go into Google and type in word cloud generator, you'll see a lot of these little software things pop up. So have fun with it, because some of them will let you do in all different colors and stuff as well. So, and it's great if you're procrastinating because you don't want to write, so you can make lots of word clouds. Can you tell what I do? That was from Jeanette. I'm up. Sorry, it's really teeny on my screen. I've been asked. It says, I like the idea. I can't really see your names. I'm sorry because it's so squished. I like the idea of Romans playing board games, and the question is, what's my favorite Roman board game? There's a couple of them that we know about. There's this absolutely mental one that more or less translates into soldiers. Historians aren't quite sure what the rules of these games are. I like this particular one because it was obviously done on a grid that almost looks like what you'd see for drafts or checkers for the Americans who've tuned in, like me. And you see these all over the place. If you go to Rome, for example, there's a couple of sites where people who are bored have carved them into the steps leading up into some of the buildings, some of the temples. And some of the Romans were really, really hardcore. I mean, if you'll indulge, some of the Romans are really, really hardcore about these games. And there's one guy, so I've got here the one I wanted to talk about. Yeah, the one I'm talking about is called Robbers or Soldiers. That's how it's translated. It's described by Ovid. It's really popular and it was really complex. So if you're familiar with Isidore of Seville, who was a 7th century Spanish, for want of a better word, author, he was an enthusiast who wrote about the game, and he was in fact buried with his gaming pieces. It's amazing. But the guy that I like, and this is the reason I like this game, is just how people got so intense about it. It's this fellow called Julius Canus. He was a philosopher who was sentenced to execution by Gaius Caligula for who knows what, having two eyebrows or something. Anyway, he was playing the game when the soldiers came to fetch him and drag him away to be executed, and he demanded that the guards double-checked the board because he was winning, and he wanted this to go into the historical records. Now you know this, and his wish has been fulfilled, and that's in Seneca. I know I've got some Seneca fans out there listening in to this broadcast webinar. So there you go. All right, thank you. I think when it comes to Roman games, my favorites are more along the lines of ball games with some enthusiasts there. Let's see another question I've got here. Tum. Ooh, this one's in all caps. Somebody's yelling at me. Yikes! Thanks. A nice loaded question here from somebody I know saying, what do I think of Edward Gibbon's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire? I think it's something that shows up a heck of a lot in my students' papers, and I think it needs to be clearer when he was actually writing. So it's been a while since I've dipped into him. He is a product of his time. So for those of you who don't know, he published the book in 1776, and it's more reflective of what was going on in the British Empire at that time. It's from Gibbon that, of course, the popular idea that Christianity caused the Romans to become weak and to lose their martial spirit, it comes from Gibbon. He's also the fellow who tells us that the era of the 5 good emperors was the height of the Pax Romana, for example. It's an old work. It's an important work because it comes from the time of the development of what's called now scientific history. And when philosophers and writers were starting to study both classical history and medieval history as an historical time period that you could learn about politics from. And of course, in the late 18th century, you're going to have a number of politicians who are studying the late Republic, for example. So you see this because of the French Revolution, a lot of the authors there, and the American Revolution. Sorry, I'm going to call it the American Revolution. Sorry, I'm American. So it is very much a product of its time. So I think it needs to be read carefully now. This is a good example. I'm glad you brought it up. It's a good example of classical reception because even though it's not from the Roman period, it's a book about the Roman period and how the Roman period has been studied and how our perception of Rome has changed, as well as how current events can affect how we interpret what we see in the Roman world and how the Roman world can be used for metaphors in current political and social situations. So a big question, but a very good one to have been brought up. Thank you, Dr. Whitehurst. She's laughing, I hope. Let's see. Oops. Oh, my favorite work of historical fiction, probably the last customs slip I wrote when I came back from the United States, but I joke. My favorite historical fiction. Ooh, I'd have to actually think about it. It's not going to be something Roman. Sorry to disappoint. To be honest with you, it's probably going to be Margaret Atwood's Alias Grace, which she's one of my favorite authors, and that was one of my favorite books. It's based on an historical character in Canada. It's this big sensational murder trial in Toronto in the 19th century that she became very fascinated with. I think Netflix made a series out of it, but I read the book years ago when it came out, and I like the combination of the research that she's done with it, but also the story and the world that she's created around it. I like the voice of the book, if that makes any sense. So I think that's going to be up there in among the ones that I like the best, I think. Thank you. Let's see. I think this is the last question. What aspect of life in ancient Rome do we know the least about? That's a very good question. Let me have a little think about that. Reconstructing anything in the Roman world is a bit tricky because of almost the sort of scatter approach of the sources that survive. It can be very difficult to create a paradigm because the sources are so widely spread. It's lucky that we have some of the things that we do. I think some historians would argue that something such as, for example, the mystery cults, the religious mystery cults are really hard to know because, well, it's exactly as it says on the tin. Their rites and their rituals were kept secret, and they weren't written down, with the assumption that if you didn't belong to one of these cults, you didn't need to know about it because it was very secretive. And if you were in one of the cults, why should you have to talk about it? So that's one thing. But I think on a wider scale, what we don't know a lot about the lower classes. There's a lot about women that we don't know. And again, that's the nature of the sources, because most of the sources that survive, written sources, are written by aristocratic men who have a particular purpose for their writing. So they're going to be casting everything towards that particular purpose. We do have writing from women in the sense that there are tombstones, you know, the wife of so-and-so put up this particular tombstone, but those are very public monuments. So they're going to be formulaic. We just don't, I don't know, even when you see images, for example, there was a really good book that was published back when I was a graduate student about working women in Ostia that was taking some carvings and images of depicting women at work. And one of the things the author had said was, we see these women at work, but we don't know what they thought. We don't know if they had particular motivations. We don't know. And it's the same thing with the lower classes, where, you know, you have to realize that the sources we have are just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what people are thinking. And there's a lot of personal motivation that's going to be lost. Just about every year, I've got a student who wants to do their undergraduate dissertation on what was Julius Caesar really thinking. Can I get inside Augustus's head? Or they want to do a psychological study of Nero and his mother. It's tempting, but we can't do it. We can't get inside their heads. We are missing that context. And I think, well, that's what's filled in, really, when you have historical fiction, where you've got someone imagining or reconstructing what this person might have thought based on what sources that we have left. So, gosh, that sounds a bit dismal, doesn't it? But there's lots and lots that we're missing. And even historians have to do a lot of reconstruction based on what sources they do have. So thank you. That was a very good question. These have all been really good questions, very thoughtful. I think I've got all of them. Have I missed any?
I think I'll just read them to you, actually, Carey. So we've had a question from Paula, who says, have you ever thought about writing a novel based in ancient Rome, and what would it be about?
I have, and I have. I do have an almost completed manuscript of a fictional novel that takes place in Roman Britain. And it's written for a younger audience, probably like 12 to 15. Is that young adult? I never know what the distinctions are. So see, I don't read enough to find out. It takes place in Roman Britain. She is the daughter of one of the military commanders who is sent to Hadrian's Wall, and he's up on the wall because he's a soldier and he's in charge, and his family lives back in Rome. So they're very wealthy and they live back in Rome. And she's a very bright girl who's not particularly happy about what her life is going to be like when she gets molded into that ideal Roman woman. And she is over the moon when her father sends for the family to come and live up on Hadrian's Wall and to come and live up in one of the fortresses that's up there. So it's a lot of stuff that I've used based on some of the documents from Vindolanda, for example, and some of the work that I've done on children and women's history. So it's there. And I'm in the same boat with the other historical fiction writers who now need to put together a proposal to see if I can get this out there and unleash it on the world. Thank you.
Oh, wow, that sounds amazing. We can't wait to read it. So we had another question from Katie, who said, hi, Carey. Is there an era in fiction set in Rome that drives you crazy?
Oh, thanks, Katie. They just want to see me go nuts, because my students like this. They like to watch me come slowly unglued. Let me have a think. There's so many to choose from. Names drive me nuts, and I put this in my Roman book as well. I've probably seen Gladiator about 4 billion times because my mother's favorite actor for a while was Russell Crowe. So we had Gladiator, Robin Hood, and what's the other, Master and Commander on constant rotation when I was looking after her about 10 years ago. And it's his name. I mean, just the basics of putting a name together, it just makes me grind my teeth. So I have a whole section in the book on that. I think what I always say to my students is if finding errors in films like Gladiator was a drinking game, you'd be dead before Marcus Aurelius. But in a way, that's kind of part of the fun. So I don't let it get in the way. But yeah, the names grind my gears. They really do. So there you go. Thanks, Katie.
Thank you. And one final question from Karen, who says, who was the better poet, Virgil or Ovid? And who was the bigger jerk?
Crikey. Gosh. As far as better poet, I'd have to pop out and punt that over to Paula, who's listening in, because Paula is our epic specialist. She's our Greek epic specialist, but she does Roman as well. I've had to work with both because the book that I'm currently writing, sorry, it's this nonfiction book that's currently in work is a Carolingian thing, the classical world in the Carolingians, and there's a lot of Virgil and Ovid in there. I like Virgil a lot. I've had to read the Aeneid like 1 billion times since I was a child in Latin, because of course that's the standard text. I've still got my big purple copy of the Aeneid, throbbing purple copy that's up there. I like Virgil. I'm not saying the Aeneid, I'm saying Virgil. I like him because the story that I like about him is in order to get like this big tax break, he found this loophole in the law that if you had a mausoleum on your property, you didn't have to pay taxes. So he had a funeral for a housefly and he built a mausoleum for it and stuck it on his property so he didn't have to pay taxes, which I don't know. I have to admire that sort of chutzpah. And the other thing I like pointing out to my students, if I assign chunks of the Aeneid to them, because I do a lot of stuff on Augustus, so they have to slog through some Virgil stuff. Is I always remind them that, you know, they only have to read it for like a 50-minute seminar, and it took him 12 years to write it, so come on. When it comes to which one's the bigger jerk, gosh, I think, well, Ovid got himself into a lot more trouble than Virgil did, didn't he? Because, I mean, with getting exiled, I mean, one of the rumors of that was he was one of the Emperor Augustus's daughters, many lovers, that sort of thing. What comes across as kind of jerkish with him, I can't remember if it's in Tristia or Ex Ponto. I think it's in Ex Ponto. These are two works that he wrote when he was in exile. He was someone who, of course, made his living through his words and how elegant his writing was and his writing is, and he was really up himself about it. And he writes, like I said, I can't remember if it's Ex Ponto or Tristia, so hopefully somebody's frantically Googling that for me. That he couldn't have thought of a worse punishment for a man of letters such as himself to be sent to this little podunk town on the edge of the Black Sea, because no one there really spoke Latin very well. So he couldn't communicate with them, and when he had to speak to them, he had to speak in the local language, which basically reduced this great poet to a me Tarzan, you Jane sort of type of communication. And yeah, I think in the jerk sweepstakes, I'm going to say Ovid. So there you go. Thanks, Karen.
Oh, brilliant. Well, on that note, I think this is a good moment to wrap up this armchair event and to thank everyone for attending, but also to thank you, Carey, for giving up your time to participate.
Oh, there's a cat here. I know I promised a cat. Hang on.
Oh.
Can you see him? There he is.
Oh. So for anyone who would like to get a copy of A Writer's Guide to Ancient Rome, an email will follow at the end of this event with details on how to order. So thanks everyone, and if you enjoyed this event, why not sign up for future armchair events? Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, or sign up for the MUP newsletter on our website, where information will be shared about upcoming events. So thanks everyone, goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.